Hello, my name is Melissa Kahn, and I'm the director of the Venice office of Save Venice. I'm pleased to present a webinar featuring Dr. Diego Calaon, an esteemed archaeologist from Venice's Ca' Foscari University, who specializes in the anthroecological reappraisal of the origins of Venice. The lecture will last 25 minutes and will be followed by a brief question and answer session. So please use the Q&A and the chat function on your screen to post questions during the lecture that then we will answer at the end. Before Diego begins, I'd like to give a little bit of a presentation of Save Venice's interest in Torcello. It all began in 1977 when Save Venice joined the International Torcello Committee. It was a group of international committees who joined forces to raise funds for the restoration of mosaics in Torcello. More recently, we adopted the iconostasis in the church. It's a project in collaboration with Venice in Peril, the British organization, and it's in memory of the historian John Julius Norwich. Save Venice will be celebrating its 50th anniversary in 2021, and we selected two very important projects to celebrate. We have the mosaics in the Basilica Santa Maria Assunta in Torcello and the Italian synagogue in the ghetto. Our Torcello project concentrates on two of the apse. We have the central apse with the Madonna Hodegitria, and we have the apse next to that, which is the Diaconicon apse with the Christ Pantocrator mosaics. And we are extremely grateful to all of our generous donors who are making this project possible for us. Of course, we're not only working on the mosaics, it's also very, very important to reinforce the walls because we have an issue with crumbling brick and very loose mortar. So that's taking place simultaneously as we work on the interior walls, we fix the mosaics on the outside. Our worksite had been open for about a month, starting last October, when on November 12th, Venice was hit with the second largest high tide in its history. Torcello and many other sites in Venice were underwater numerous times in November and December. Save Venice launched the Immediate Response Fund, and we were joined by the Italian Embassy in Washington with their America Loves Venice campaign. And with this funding, we were able to supply emergency funds to Torcello for the flooding and 22 other sites in Venice. After the flooding subsided, our work resumed, and we have various projects within the church all having to do with the apse and the mosaics and the stone elements that are connected to them. We're very fortunate to have with us Giovanni Cucco, a mosaic restorer who has more than 50 years of experience. You'll note we have the photo of him that I used in the 1978 mosaic restoration slide because Giovanni Cucco was also responsible for that restoration. What we're going to talk about today is a new discovery that came about while we were checking the structural integrity of this area of the church. It's the vault of the Diaconicon chapel, which is this area here, if you can see my cursor, and the area here. While examining that area, we needed to make a little opening in the roof so we could look down and see if the vault was stable. And while looking down, we saw a little fragment of red and realized that that meant that there were frescoes. And so from then, the small opening in the roof led to a much larger opening in the roof, and we brought in several experts to start studying them. And that is what we're going to hear about from Diego Calaon now. He's going to tell you about the fresco fragments and what that actually means for the history of Torcello. So Diego is the archaeologist from Ca' Foscari University who is following the conservation project for us. So if Diego would like to present, we'd be happy to hear from him. Okay.
Okay, sorry, there was a slight delay on sharing my screen. Thank you very much, Save Venice, for having me. And I think everything is set now, and I'm going to tell something about the archaeology of Torcello and how Torcello is so pivotal for learning the origin of Venice, and how much this new discovery is important to set up the agenda for the next step in the archaeological project in Torcello, and learn a lot of information about the chronology of the church itself, but also the chronology of the island itself. So our question today is how did Venice come into the world? And so we will try to understand this question looking underground and looking how archaeological record, archaeological data in Torcello, with our project that is named Torcello Abitata, is helping to understand a different story about the origin of Venice. A story that is much more concerned with the economics and the environment, and also the presence of the Church of Torcello, narrative that is much more related to the barbarian invasion and the displacement of old Venetian people from the mainland to the islands. Here you have how Venice looked like in the early Middle Age. This strange picture is showing the basement of one of the oldest houses that has been possible to excavate in Torcello. It was a quite big house, wooden house, so you are seeing walls and the mud where the wooden beams were positioned. And these houses were quite sophisticated. They were two-floors houses, and the ground floor you had a fireplace, and also you have all the facilities for hosting, for getting out directly to the channel and having all the tools for having your boat just placed of the house. These houses were completely built on wood. So the reason that we have hard time to understand how Venice looked like in the past is because up to the 12th centuries, everything in Venice itself and in Torcello were built on timber. The Torcello archaeological excavation show us that houses were very well planned on the areas. So there were no improvisation on building them. So it is clear that there is a plan, a design. So the idea that people move here abruptly after a war is absolutely unproved by the archaeology, because we see clearly a design on putting working classes in very distinct houses, all with the same size, and putting different islands, all surrounding water cisterns, collecting water from the roofs of the wooden houses. So if we want to have a pictorial images of Venice, we have to look this very nice drawing that is medieval drawings redrawn in 16th century from the Biblioteca Nazionale Marciana, the library, the National Library in Venice. You can see here that everything is timber. All the houses, all the warehouses, but also the church, the bell tower. All the city is balancing in between the water, the mud of this tiny islet, and the timber that the ancient Venetian used to build the city. So when we are speaking about the origin of Venice, we have to face with the problem of the myth and the narratives that many years of very important Venetian state, the Serenissima, produce about it. So we have to ask ourselves if the history that we can find easily if we Google Venice origin, for example, the history that tell us that there were Roman civitas that were destroyed during the barbarian invasion, and so they forced the Venetian to move in the Legon Island, and then from there move finally to Rialto, the center of Venice today. These origins, this myth, is a made-up narrative that has been made up during the late Middle Age and the modern time in Venice to rebuild a sort of a very mythical history of the birth, having a very enemy, Attila, or all the barbarians, and showing how the early Venetian were so brave that they could escape and save themselves, save their democratic power in a tiny island among the waters. So here are the map has it is shown and narrated by this chronicle, but this history is a sort of historical fake news, let's say like that. It is a narrative built over the centuries that the archaeology is absolutely rewriting. And the narrative, the traditional narrative, the myth, is really stressing the role of the barbarian that would have pushed the Venetian among the water, and the water would have been the place that saved the Venetian from the war. But in fact, water had, since what we see in the archaeology, a completely different meaning. They moved, yes, on the water, but not for being safe. They moved the water because the water was the best place, the island among the waters, was a place where to live. Because in fact, we have to consider the environmental and the economic perspective and the changing in environmental and the geographic constraint to understand how this settlement started. So we have to consider Venice and Torcello in a much more broader picture. Venice and Torcello are not the only sign that start their life in the early Middle Ages, so when the Roman Empire start to fall down. In particular, our settlement in the Venice Lagoon, they were all connected with the river mouth landscape. So all these sites were exactly place where the ancient river delta met the seaside. So they were the perfect place for trading towards water, so for hosting harbors. So the archaeological perspective is completely different from the historical one and from the narrative one, the mythical one. We have a very complex, set of signs that they are less in number from the previous time, the Roman times, but they are very very specifically characterized with the infrastructure side. So they were harbor. They were placed with a lot of workforces working for the local elites for making possible to build ships and boats and unload and unload the cargo that arrived from the east and the south of the Mediterranean. This is the first things that we found, the first phase that we found. Is warehouse, in fact. It is a wooden warehouse with stone used only as a floor ground for the pillars. These warehouses were meant to collect all the amphoras with oil, wine, or spices coming from the Mediterranean to be stored for a while, awaiting the right time to sail the river up to the mainland. So, Torcello, in somehow, according to archaeology, is not the first Venice, but is better to say that it is the late Roman harbor of Altino. In fact, archaeology shows us that this structure, this harbor structure, were directly connected with the Roman city of Altino, nearby the island of Torcello, and they lasted also after Venice started. So we understood that the reason why the settlement is there, both in Torcello and both in Rialto, is connected with the of the river and the geographical change that the landscape has. And in that very specific point, it was possible to set up structure like that they were basically infrastructure harbor related. Everything that is built in Torcello and Venice in the early Middle Age is built reusing old stones from the Roman cities. So if something is true from the myths and the narrative, is the fact that everything, objects, stone and bricks comes from Altino, not only people. So there is no stone in Torcello or in Venice that is not reused. So everything is reused from Roman time. Archaeology can help us to rewrite this history using an ecological anthropological approach. So we can use three proxies: wood, and the early Venetian society. So if we focus in another side, the name is Malamocco, is further south, considering Venice, we can see that there were structure there, wooden structure, that they could really be considered the starting of Venice. These structures, these wooden structures, that they are now underwater, so we excavated them with underwater excavation, and when them with the C14 and we look at the materials, we understand that this, for example, was an early medieval church dated to the 8th century before the building, they started building the San Mark Church in Rialto itself. That church was decorated with wooden panels engraved like you see in the picture. Wood, as I said, was something fundamental. I'm showing you here an example about the massive use of wood in a harbor like Venice, like Torcello. Here's the Comacchio, another site further south. If we count in Comacchio, for example, how many trees they had to cut down and saw every day for making that size of harbor, we have to consider hundreds of trees cut down. So we are speaking of huge labor need. Labor need, but also another element to be considered is the presence of water, that is salty water around, and there is not fresh water. What you are seeing there is the first Venetian well. That is not a well, is a cistern that collects raining water from the roof of this wooden building and filter it towards a sandy layer, the yellow one in the picture. These infrastructure, they are so this is another element that shows us that the local elite, namely the bishop of Torcello, really designed the settlement and the island, putting houses and water system to let the workers that they were semi-slaves to live and to prosperate. In fact, another question is asking about who were the first Venetian. Of course, we had the bishop, we had some rulers, but the main part of the population were not free people. And in fact, Venice is very well known in the historical sources as a place of slavery. Not only for having not free people working in Venice itself, but also for fueling a trade of slaves from North Europe towards the south of the Mediterranean, towards Alexandria in Egypt, to the Islamic world. So another element that is really present in this picture that is very much different from the romantic one that we read in the iconic book about the history of Venice is that everything started with wooden houses, with workforces and trade that also slave trade. Workforces were very needed for implementing all the infrastructure that the Venetian needed. For example, if we have to count how many people, how many work hours we needed for making the channel that surrounded the island and making possible the connection between the island, the number are very massive. So the fortune of Venice is also linked on the ability that the first Venetian ruler, the bishop in Torcello and the duke in Venice, had to control huge number of people. We can also ask ourselves how many people were living in Torcello at the very beginning, in the early Middle Age. There are many hypotheses that they are saying that they were 30,000, 40,000, 50,000. Now, with this archaeological appreciation, knowing how big they are, the house, and how big were the islands in the early Middle Age, we can have a much better estimation, and we can say that the inhabitants in Torcello were in between 1,500 and 2,500. That is a massive number if you consider that at that time Rome had only 20, 30,000 inhabitants. So among these 2,000 roughly inhabitants in Torcello, more were slaves or semi-slaves. This is the thing that we have to consider. That is at the beginning was a production site at the harbor. So the main part of the population were workers that were working there for making the harbor infrastructure possible to trade from the east all the product that you have on the left of your picture. So oil, wine, spices, and so on. But also there are all the goods that the Venetian, they were trading towards the south and toward the east. So we mentioned the slaves, but we have also a lot of relics, but also Venetian, they were providing shipping service, travel services for pilgrims, and for everyone had to move to the east and to Constantinople or to Alexandria. Was the only way to travel at that time. The only way was getting Venice and take a ship from there. In this picture, in July 2020, thanks to the restoration that Save Venice is financing in Torcello Basilica, in the point that Melissa Cohn pointed you before, in the Torcello church, a new discovery is shedding light on how we have to deal with this myth of the region. So, we can answer now the question about the original church. It has been said for long years that the church that we are seeing now, this is a 3D reconstruction, is the Byzantine church that the bishop Torcello in the early 11th century rebuilt and refurbished with the very nice mosaics that we can see now. But art historians were also claiming that the church was also Byzantine style, also in the early 7th century and the 9th century. And this was a subject of a huge debate among art historians worldwide. In the point that Melissa pointed to you before in the church, so over these yellow curved ups where the mosaics is now, upstairs was possible to find a place where still 9th century's fresco were still preserved. They were there still preserved because when they rebuilt this area with the mosaics in the 11th century, they didn't need to erase that part of the fresco. All the fresco were also on the in all the chapel up to the down to the bottom, but that part wasn't removed. So thanks to this exceptional remaining, we can have these very fading frescoes, but they are so important because they bear also inscription. Here you can see a face of a saint that has the aureola around his head, and the inscription here is quite clear, and it says in Latin, Sanctus Martinus, Saint Martin. Saint Martin is a Western saint, is not a Byzantine saint at all. It came from the Carolingian Empire. It is a saint that is worshipped in the Carolingian area, and the fact that his chapel probably was dedicated to Saint Martin tells us a lot about the adhesion and the style, the artistic style that the 9th century basilica had. In the picture, you can see also another figure. Here you have another head that is having a conversation with Saint Martin. There is some building on behind and also here. We are not sure which scene of Saint Martin saint life is narrated here, but probably is one the early life. So when he start to understand that he can leave all his goods and enter in the church and be a saint person. You can see here an appreciation of the inscription, and this inscription is so well preserved, and with our analysis, epigraphical analysis, we can say without, not without any doubt, but quite sure that this way of writing is absolutely to be dated to the end of the 18th century, early 9th century at the most. On the other side, we had the most iconic discovery of this July 2020. There is another panel, much better preserved with an image of Virgin Mary. You can see the Virgin Mary with the aureola and with the veil, and some gems also engraved at the level of the top of the head. The fact that it is Mary is also confirmed that there is a letter here, you can see an R, and here there is a fading A. This is the name of the Virgin Mary. It was written in two lines, as was quite at that time. The style of this fresco, the way the color is used, the way the eyes are painted, they are absolutely to be linked with the Western Carolingian or European style, so not a Byzantine style. You can see that everything is very vivid. The color now are fading, but at the time they were very, very bright. But also is vivid the way that the scene is speaking. Mary here, and here there is another figure. You can tell that there is another lady that is entering the room, and it seems that they are talking each other. Probably they are talking each other. The lady is here and Virgin Mary is here, because here you can see another fading presence of another head with a clipper. Probably is the angel Gabriel, and probably this is a panel that is telling us that we are seeing the earliest annunciation depicting of the history of art in Venice, because we don't have frescoes so old in Venice dating to the 9th century. The top part is decorated with cornucopias and fruit, and usually we had at that time in between panels, because we have to consider, we are in the top here, that we had a lot of panels like that one preserved, one on top of the other, telling the history from top to down. Thanks to these discoveries and the fact that we can really date the place and the wall where they are standing on, now we have a much more clear idea about the chronology of everything that is built and preserved in Torcello. This also is possible following the restoration works that you saw before, that help us as archaeologists to date also with archaeometrical techniques, so C14 and thermoluminescence, the mortar and the and everything that can tell us the date of the structure. And so we can understand how the church evolved through time. And what we know now, or what we understood now, that is very recent, is that the main church, like it is now, it is dated to the 9th century, and is very, very new, and it is absolutely opening a new way of interpreting Venice in a pre-Byzantine way. Excavation that I show you are normally open in summer. This summer, thanks, due to the COVID-19 situation, are not open, but they will be open next summer. And so I'll invite all of you to visit us, because we do a lot of opening hours and opening visit, and also it's possible to excavate it also with us if you like. I close here my presentation, and I close with a very iconic word from Venice that probably is the most important heritage that the Venetian left in the world. That is ciao, that means schiavo, slave, and is the way that the Venetian greeted themselves since the Middle Age. And thank you very much for having me.
Okay, thank you, Diego. That was an excellent presentation. I just have one question.
Yeah.
How surprised were you to discover the 9th century frescoes? Is that something unusual?
Yeah, absolutely. I was incredible surprised because normally ninth century ever in Europe or in Southern Europe. And the fact they were preserved in an iconic so-called Byzantine building like Torcello were also more surprising. Also, the placement where they are is really unlikable to be preserved. If permit, if I show I share my screen again to show you exactly where the fresco were. So I bring you in one minute in a sort of virtual visit of the frescoes. This is a 3D reconstruction that we did in the last days of the top part of the vault over the Diaconicon chapel. So it was completely filled with soil. So we had an archaeological excavation from that level down, and while we were excavating, we were so delighted to find these traces. Here you can see St. Martin on that side, and I go slowly on the other side. Sorry, I zoom out too much. And here you can see the side where the Virgin Mary is. Sorry. Oh, here you are. So this place is really, really unlikable to preserve such an important element. But also the fact that it is so high in the walls that no one went over there. It is so important for us because we can have archaeometric measurements and archaeometric analysis on that materials that are like we had found them on the ground, and so we can treat them as archaeological object and really improve our data set.
Okay. Another question that's come through is, would frescoes like this have been common in the area around Venice in the 9th century, or was this unusual?
That is a great question, because since what we know so far from history, I will answer no, absolutely uncommon. Torcello is really the exception. But to better answer the question, we have to consider that 9th century frescoes in Europe are so rare that we have 5 or 6 examples in all Europe. We have in South Italy, in San Vincenzo al Volturno, we have in Aachen, so where Charlemagne had his chapel. We have some presence in the Alps, in both in North Italy. But normally in the Adriatic area, we don't have them. And if we have them, since yesterday, probably an art historian will have answered, yes, probably we had frescoes, but the style should have been Byzantine style or much more southern. The fact that the style is absolutely northern, or let's say Carolingian, is very new, and we have now to digest it and to understand what it means.
Okay, so do you think there's a chance we may find other frescoes under the roof line and other areas of the church if we're able to continue?
I think yes, because there is a very equivalent chapel on the other side that is completely now painted with one color paint in the 16th century, and probably there is something behind. But the vault system is the same. So it's possible that the same system of vault has been done in the 11th century and have preserved this top part of the frescoes. But also we had a very last minute discovery that happened this very week. Following the conservation work in the main apse, the director of the works decided to remove an altar that is dated to the 16th century because he needs to check the state, the health of the wall behind. And doing so, we found a area that is completely filled with small fragments of fresco removed from the church. What happened? They removed in the 11th century the frescoes for letting space room for the mosaics, but by the fact that this fresco, they are speaking about religious subjects, they were sacred themselves. So they took care of them and they buried in a place that we call in Italian buca sacra, so it's a holy hole, a place where you put very important things. This excavation is really started 2 days ago, so I'm hoping that join you in few weeks or in few months with much more elements about his history.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Calaon. We're very happy with your excellent presentation, and we really look forward to learning about more discoveries on Torcello. So, and thank you to everyone who joined our webinar, and we look forward to a future presentation and keeping everyone informed. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.